Hello and welcome everyone to a very special show here tonight on our Facebook page at Noose News on primary election night 2026, and I am so excited that you have joined us. We have some very special guests with us tonight, so let's start by introducing them. So first of all, you guys probably know her already. She is the managing editor of Noose News. Her name is Christy Kelly. So Kelly, say hello to everyone.
Hi everybody, welcome.
And then of course we have our very own Catherine Hardy, a Noose News political analyst, if you will, who's not new at all to our live election night show coverage that we typically do. So happy to have you here as well, Catherine. And then I suppose we could say our very special guest of honor tonight is former NC Senator Mr. Jim Perry, who we are so very thankful to have with us. So thank y'all for being here.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Before we keep going, we have to take a moment to thank our sponsors. We have a couple sponsors tonight that make programming like we're doing here at Noose News possible, and we simply just couldn't do it without them. So we want to say thank you to Walter Pool Realty and Brooks Pool, as well as Chris Humphrey for NC House. They are our two sponsors for this programming tonight. And as we've already mentioned, by the time this airs, we will be just a few minutes away from the polls closing on the primary election night for 2026. We have a lot of races, a lot of things to talk about, and that's what we're going to do here tonight. We're just going to have a conversation and let these folks chime in and give their, I guess you could say, expert opinions on some of the things facing our districts and our counties. Specifically, as you may know, Noose News covers Lenoir-Jones and Greene County. So those are especially important to us, as well as some of the couple of state races that we have going on that will have direct impacts on us as well. So speaking of Lenoir-Jones and Greene County, Christy, I'm going to start with you. You can kick us off, and everyone can just, chime in as they feel like they had something they want to share. But in Greene, Jones, and Lenoir counties, what issues are actually moving voters this cycle versus what gets the most attention online? I think this is a very relevant question.
I think this is actually both of the same answer this time, specifically this year. I think the property tax rates came in. I think they came and the people got their tax bill, and it was higher than they anticipated. They have shown up at town halls. They've shown up at city council meetings. They've shown up at county commissioner meetings. I think that is a huge issue that is going to drive people to the polls this year.
Catherine, you agree?
Absolutely. I mean, you look at it, and it's one of those rare things where you have people, they're angry online. The Facebook comment threads are epic. But then, like you said, it's not just online. So frequently when there are issues, they catch people's attention. It's a huge controversy online. But when it comes time for people to actually show up, either to vote or to actually speak in person, there's nobody there. But this time, the people, that online rage, that definitely moved offline, because at the end of the day, this is something that hits people where it hurts the most, and it was also so unexpected.
In their pocketbook.
In their pocketbooks, and it was not what people were expecting when they opened those bills when they came out last summer. So,
Jim, I bet you've not heard a single word about taxes, have you?
Never heard anything about those. Tell me more about this property tax issue. Yeah, it's not just Lenoir County. It's every county in the state that had a reval. When you think about the way building supplies have increased, labor costs have increased, the value of homes has risen. Can I tell you it's where they've been evaluated to be in every county? No, I can't tell you that. I think we'll see some action on this issue at the General Assembly. More discussion in the short session, and definitely something by the long would be my guess.
Yeah, that sort of leads me into exactly what I was going to ask you next, Jim. We'll go with you on this one too, coming right off what you just said. In light of that, what does the local really mean this year? Which problems that we may be facing here are county controlled, but which ones are really Raleigh controlled, and which ones are like federally controlled? And you just mentioned the taxes and Raleigh making the decisions on that. So you would say What is local this year in this primary election?
Yeah, so Raleigh does make the decision on your income taxes, which have been cut in half since 2010 in the state of North Carolina. That's clearly a state decision. The decision on property taxes are local decisions based upon the revaluation and where they set their millage rate, what they take from the people. What really makes people mad is when we talk about this concept of revenue neutral, which that doesn't mean your house appraises for the same thing it did the year before. It doesn't mean you don't pay more taxes. Typically about 40% of the people will pay more in taxes. Revenue neutral means that the county should collect the same amount of money it did in the previous cycle, but it doesn't mean that everybody's being charged the same amount. You know, it moves around, you get some new properties, you lose some. But revenue neutral does not mean that your taxes on your house stay at the same level, as many people have found out in many counties.
Yes, I think that's been something that we've seen online that has been, for whatever reason, people have seemed to have had a hard time really trying to grasp the understanding of that. You know, some things are not just, they're just simply not that simple. They make sense, but sometimes it just takes a minute for, you know, the average folk like me to really understand exactly what is happening, why it is happening, how it is happening. So we definitely know that taxes is at the top of a lot of voters' lists this year going into it, which was, you know, what is really the deciding factor on the for the voter turnout? Is it just strictly, because I think there was a time in our not too far past that really it seemed to me to be very much like party based. That was the driving point. Like, I'm a Republican, I'm a Democrat, so I'm going to go vote all Republican, or I'm going to go vote all Democrat, right? But like we were just saying with the taxes this year, it seems like specific, if you will, controversies seem to be driving that more than party based. What do you guys think about that? You agree? Disagree?
I think initially that's how you learn to vote. You learn to vote through the party of your parents. And then I think as you become educated on different issues, you start to form your own opinion. But I think when issues like the taxes hit your actual pocketbook and you really have to make decisions now based on the occurrence of what has happened, that's going to motivate you more to be a part of that conversation, at least to be a part of the discussion. And then you can execute that with your vote.
And I think, too, local races, they don't tend to fit so neatly into national political party frameworks because, you know, at the end of the day, when you're talking about a race for county commissioner in Lenoir County, that is not a race where the major motivating factors for the National Republican or Democratic Party are really, I mean, those are not decisions that are being made at the county commissioner level. It's just property taxes and things that are really that matter much more on a day-to-day basis. And so what candidates say, what they promise, what they believe about those local issues are way more important than whatever party label they've chosen to attach to themselves, or at least it should be.
Yeah. I think that's right. You know, for years, North Carolina avoided syncing up with national politics. Like, our Democrats in North Carolina were different than national Democrats. Our Republicans were different than national Republicans. We've had so much sorting, and the extreme wing of the Republican Party and the Democrat Party, you know, that 15%.
Right.
They really believe in that purity test. And I think that is what is growing the unaffiliated voter base. If you think about it on a statewide basis, and I agree,
That's a good point.
locally, we fill potholes, we pay the bills, we supply money to the schools.
Right.
We don't have as much of this party stuff that you have at the state and federal levels. But you cannot win statewide if you can't win the unaffiliated voters. If voters vote at parity, think about it, about 30% are Democrats, 30% are Republicans, they're not going to decide the election. It's whoever can appeal to that
In between.
that
That's right.
unaffiliated voter. And right now in our state, about 40% are breaking for Republicans, and about 60% are breaking for Democrats.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Okay, let's move on and talk about some specific races. We won't go through every single race that is happening or being decided tonight, but we are going to touch on a few of them. We've got Jones, Lenoir, and Greene County all have county commissioner races. Now, I'm not going to say any names, but we might know someone running for one of those. For voters, let's just ask this question, and this question is for anyone. What would you guys say are the 2 or 3 decisions that a county commissioner will make that residents of that county will feel the most? How would you answer that? What would you say some of the things that they decide that are some of the most important things?
Well, we've already discussed probably what most voters care about, the absolute most, which is property tax rates. They don't decide the valuation for property, but they do decide the tax rates, and those decisions decide what your tax bill ends up being. But they also decide things about the county budget based on the income from those property taxes, things like the amount that county workers get paid, sheriff's deputies, how much those deputies get paid, jail employees, how much they get paid, which in turn drives how well the county can attract good candidates for those positions. And not having enough school bus drivers or sheriff's deputies, that impacts people on a daily basis. So their thoughts on what the budget should be and how much of that budget should be go to funding employee salaries, that makes a big difference.
Yes, and you just mentioned several different things. You mentioned county employees. You mentioned the schools and the things and the sheriff's department, which I know is a part of the county's budget there or whatever. Of those things that you've mentioned, what would you say the biggest pressure point of a county commissioner's budget is right now?
Flood mitigation would come up to work with their state legislators to make sure that the county has money in case of another emergency. I think all 3 counties that's a very high priority for at least the ones that I cover.
Okay. Jim, do you agree with what she said about flood mitigation and the county commissioner?
I think it's certainly a concern and something on their mind. Just like the largest expense for any business is always personnel. I think that is probably one of the toughest things they deal with, on having competitive salaries. And what do you do when you know that, okay, this county pays more, but when your county is losing population, which means you have fewer people to pay the bills, so everybody here has to pay more. When you talk about giving raises, you really have to look around and ask each other, whose taxes are we going to raise?
Right.
And it has to be uniform in North Carolina, so you're going to raise everyone's taxes. That's the natural tension that occurs with wanting to provide a certain amount of revenue for the salary and wanting to balance the taxes. And when you're losing population, it does not make that any easier.
And, people, do you want to have a well-staffed sheriff's department? Of course we do,
Sure.
Right? I want somebody to be there when I call 911. I want those response times to be right there. Do you want your property taxes raised to pay for it?
Right.
Absolutely not. So
The money's got to come from
the
somewhere.
money has to come from somewhere, and in a time when the rate of rate of inflation is what it is, and it has been, as high as like 6%, but raises have been somewhere in the 2 to, you're lucky if you get a 2 to 5% raise as a government employee. When you have raises that are not even keeping pace with the rate of inflation, you're losing ground. Even as your budget is expanding and thus the amount you have to take in taxes is expanding, you're still losing ground. It puts elected officials in an enormously difficult position because voters don't want to sit around and listen to a long discussion about inflation and tax rates. They just want to know there's going to be somebody to come when I call 911, but also my property taxes aren't going to go up.
Right.
And that's a tough discussion, because when we talk about it in terms of government, I always hear this about how, well, increases didn't keep up with inflation. But remember, the vast majority of employees in this county are in private industry, and theirs
Right.
didn't either.
Yeah.
And that's tough, because we're asking them to give more money
That's right.
to take care of the government employees. It is not a job that I will apply for anytime soon. I promise you that.
Okay, let's move on to another race that our counties are facing, and that's the one for the county school board. So I'm going to start with you on this one, Catherine, if you don't mind. How much do school board races in these counties get driven by national culture fights versus local operational issues such as staffing or discipline or transportation? In 2026, how do you answer that?
2026 feels very much like this is a local year. This is not a year where there are overwhelming cultural fights. 2020, you had issues over school closures, COVID lockdowns. Those were national issues that were absolutely impacting what was happening at a local level. But those kind of national fights have cooled down. And our area, I see issues that come up in my government classes that I teach, where I ask students to talk about a local issue that impacts them. It's things like there are not enough school bus drivers. And so the routes are way too long and students have to get up too early. It's the food in the cafeteria is not very good, or the parking at the schools is not enforced correctly, or school starts too early. It is those local issues, issues that are actually just about what decisions are being made at a local level. And I think those are the issues that drive a school board election in a year like 2026. Which candidates are going to show that they are listening to the concerns that local residents have about their schools and not what's going on in the national. Unless there's something that I've missed hearing about.
I agree with you completely. I think you said it very well, that 2020 was chock full of national everything, and now we're back to our regularly scheduled program for school boards.
Yeah, that's right. I remember the accessibility of broadband internet rising to the top as a national point of discussion during COVID, and now it's like no one's really talking about that anymore. But you guys were saying that among those, I guess that would be sort of considered local infrastructure when you're talking about school buses and drivers and things like that. But in that same vein of education, I was also going to ask you guys, what local educational issue would you say is like the most undercovered or maybe even the most misunderstood, but those who work in education find it a topic of conversation constantly among, whether it's conversations like Catherine referred to earlier with students, or whether it's earlier education when you're discussing things with parents and students? What do you think from that perspective would be the most misunderstood or, like I said, undercovered issue that teachers are facing?
I think it's school funding. It's an understanding of school funding. When you compare North Carolina to other states and their funding levels, when we talk about education funding, we're usually really just talking about pay, right? Teacher compensation. Yeah. That's really what it boils down to. What most people don't understand is if you want to compare us to New York or New Jersey on teacher pay, you have to understand how they fund that pay. And I can tell you it's a lot different than we do in other states like a New Jersey or New York. The locals fund just as much as the state does. So the state will fund about 45%, locals will fund 45%. They actually have taxing authority. That's why taxes are so high on houses and things of that nature. It's a separate tax. So if you want to look like those states, you must tax like those states. And probably one of the things the General Assembly could do is just either give school boards taxing authority, which the county commissioners already have it in every county. They can raise their taxes as high as they want to fund whatever they want. But my experience is that locals would like to see new roads, but they don't want to pay for new roads.
Right.
They'd like to have more money for schools, but they don't want to pay more taxes. So it's a tough thing that most people don't understand about when you compare us to other states. The outcomes are never mentioned. We just talk about pay. Let's start talking about outcomes.
And consider that discussion about educational outcomes compared to educational funding is something I've been looking at recently, because there have been some recent kind of revelations as far as the states that are at the top are no longer the ones that used to be. It's states like Mississippi, Louisiana, Tennessee that used to be at the absolute bottom, and now they have made an amazing turnaround in outcomes, especially when it comes to fourth grade reading levels and math abilities, while their per student funding levels are at about half of what states like New York and New Jersey are. And so there's also the question of what are you getting for the amount that you are spending? And if a state like New York is spending double per student and yet their students are reading worse than a state like Mississippi, well, you're obviously not necessarily guaranteed better outcomes just by spending more money.
And I do think, I want to be clear, I think we need more money. I think our low wealth funding, North Carolina was originally one of only like 12 states that did additional low wealth funding. I think we need more. That was the original goal of the Leandro lawsuit, was more low wealth funding,
Right.
for the low wealth counties, and that kind of got hijacked over time. We've got to figure out something different. If I was a teacher in the school system for 25 years and looked at the increase I could get, I'd feel the same way they would. I understand the arguments on both sides. I just think we're probably going to have to take a different approach.
And and if you look at high funding states like New York and New Jersey, the extra amount that they're spending is not necessarily going towards teacher pay. So there are a lot of conversations to be had, but having North Carolina, having our especially lower income districts like Lenoir, Jones, and Greene have the ability to compete when it comes to quality teachers with other states, with wealthier counties. That's a very important thing for our county. But also getting students to classes. I think the bus driver issue is one that is really under addressed when it comes to conversations that happen about, when people are running for school board, because I know that for instance, for the Lenoir County Learning Academy, which is the alternative school in Lenoir County, my mom used to teach there, so she still, kind of has people she knows there. They have one bus for the entire county. Their students don't get there until 11 o'clock in the morning. They can't start school until 11 o'clock in the morning because they only have one bus. Now, obviously, that's a little bit of a different situation because it's covering the whole county, but those are students who aren't learning. And they're already students who are, at risk for, because of behavioral issues. But they're not going to get any better if they aren't getting an education. And they can't get an education if they're riding a bus for 3 hours, 4 hours in a day.
Yeah, I agree.
And, so how do you address that? I think that's something that I would love to see school board candidates actually talk about when they're campaigning. How do we get more bus drivers? How do we ensure that our students aren't having to get up and be on a bus at 5:30 in the morning, and that there is transportation to allow all students to get to school? I'm sorry, that's one of my things that
I think that's a legitimate question.
doesn't get addressed enough, and that I would
It's
love
under
to
that
hear.
funding umbrella.
Right.
How do you do it when it's the locals' responsibility to fund certain things and the state's responsibility to fund certain things? Where's the money come from?
We also have some judicial races and some races for the Court of Appeals. And so I just want to ask this question, Jim, you might want to start with the answer here. But, most voters know judicial races and like these Court of Appeals and all this are generally low information races. So how would you answer the question of why it in fact is important or does matter, whether it is statewide or whether it's federal, and the impacts it may have on us living right here in Lenoir, Jones, and Greene County? Why should voters pay attention to those races, and what makes them important to us locally?
Well, we have 3 branches of government. I'm sure you know that, unlike the Mecklenburg County Sheriff. And so it's important to have checks and balances. We had an off-camera discussion about this earlier. And it doesn't matter what the General Assembly does.
Right.
If someone goes and challenges whatever they do in court, actions of the General Assembly must be presumed to be constitutional, but they can be challenged. And the Court of Appeals would be, the final stop before the state Supreme Court to hear your case. So they decide matters of law regarding constitutionality. It's important, they set precedent, when we have a case before the Court of Appeals. So it's a roadmap for what future courts are supposed to do. People generally fall into two camps when it comes to judges. They either want someone who just follows the law as written,
Right.
and doesn't want the judge to legislate from the bench, or they want the judge to look at something and say, well, I think this is the right and proper outcome, and then work backwards and try to find some case law to support his position. It's not going to surprise you. I'm in that first group that I don't want them to have but so much leeway. Maybe your child in front of them when they decide to have leeway and throw the hammer at them on something. I'd rather it be more defined. So those races are very important because of that.
Anyone else?
We've also seen how the judicial system directly impacts our local system. Here in Lenoir County with our local election, it had to go all the way to the North Carolina Supreme Court just so that we could move forward. So while that's an extreme example, that shows you directly how the judicial system impacts your everyday life simply by allowing us to move forward with our elections.
And I would also say the high profile ones, the ones that get all of the attention, are just a minuscule amount of what those courts of appeals do on a daily basis, because they're not just dealing with potentially issues where there is someone challenging actions of the General Assembly. They're also handling criminal case appeals. So we want people on those courts who have a strong background in criminal case law, who are going to approach appeals from people who've been convicted of crimes from a position of expertise and understanding of the law. It could impact our local area if someone who, we just had a fairly high profile murder trial in Lenoir County where someone was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. I mean, that's the kind of case that is almost certainly going to get appealed for some reason. And so our local district attorney would have a very strong interest in the judge in the Court of Appeals who hears that case approaching it from a perspective like Jen was talking about, of not legislating from the bench, deciding they don't like an outcome, and instead following the law. Was the law followed? Were all of the proper procedures followed in this case? Because that's the bulk of what a state appeals court does. It's not glamorous, but it's important in ensuring that the court system functions as it should.
Just as a political aside, this is a thing for me. I don't care if it's a Republican or a Democrat. I do not like when someone says, well, the public felt like that was a terrible legal decision. And I've heard President Trump say this. I've heard President Obama say it, President Biden. I've heard them all. Judicial decisions are not about popularity contests.
No, exactly.
That kills me. So.
Yeah, but let's stay in this same vein, though, because there is an issue, speaking of online, here specifically, here with what we do at New Snooze and Magic Mind Media, we spend a lot of time online, and we are able to gauge a pulse or a heartbeat of what a general consensus online is about particular issues. And speaking in this same vein, like I said, one of the things that we're seeing people talk about a lot, and it's going to bring me to this next question here that maybe you guys can shed a little bit of light on, because we have a district attorney race happening as well. It has to do with bail. Speaking of this murder trial and things like this, one of the things that we're seeing discussed a lot is the issue, or the perceived issue, I should say, with people being arrested, being arrested multiple times for violent crimes, even in a lot of cases, given very low or no amount of bail back on the street, and then they do something worse. They kill someone, they murder someone. There seems to be confusion around who is responsible for making those kinds of decisions, which brings me to my question. What would you say one of the biggest misconceptions is about what the responsibilities of a district attorney is, versus what's the responsibility of a judge in a case like that, or what's the responsibility of a local magistrate in a case like that? Because these are the types of races that, like I said, a lot of times are very low information races, but they touch these issues within our judicial system that people care very much about. You turn someone out on the street that had little to no bail, and they murder someone, and people are upset, not just about the fact that a murder has taken place, but that someone had a track record and were released on low or no bail. So let's just touch any of that, jump off anybody, anywhere, wherever you want to start. But with big district attorney races and things like that happening, I thought it would be a point of interest to discuss that. I see that as definitely an issue among voters.
It's certainly not my area of expertise, but I do know that they each have their own guardrails that, if I'm not mistaken, are mitigated by the law. Like, they can't just pull something out of their hat and make it happen. They have to follow the established process. So, like I said, not my area of expertise, but the person who makes the arrest doesn't get to set the bond. So the magistrate doesn't do that either, as far as I know. I think that part's the judge. So there's so many moving parts. I think what's not understood is what part does what.
Yes.
I think there's a lot of confusion
I do
about
too.
the
I do
difference
too.
in district court, superior court,
Yeah.
federal court, our state court system, the federal court system. I'd always hear questions from people who were confused about that. A lot of the issues surrounding bail or someone having multiple offenses and then they're back out on the street, like we saw in Charlotte.
Right.
Unfortunately, part of that is part of the system, and the politicos won't like me saying that, and that's just too bad. It's true, right? Because
It is.
every offense is not something someone's going to be locked up for. So if you say he's got 13 offensive, well, I mean, what were they? They're looked at individually.
Right,
it's
that's
not
right.
compounded, right? So it's not as simple as we would like to make
agree.
it. I think that we want a district attorney who is inclined to prosecute, not someone who is disinterested in
Right.
prosecution. I think that we want someone who is really tough on serious crimes, where we fear for our lives or our loved ones' lives. I don't want someone who wins the steak knife award because he cleared out so many cases so quickly. I
Right.
want justice to be
That's right. That's right.
handed out.
was a
And
good
that's
movie reference.
a tough thing to do sometimes.
I agree.
And, the district attorney is not the person who determines the amount or even the setting of a bond. I mean, the district attorney can ask for a bond, but that is ultimately determined by a judge. It's first, if I'm understanding correctly, it's first set by a magistrate, but then it goes before a judge who ultimately determines the final amount. And that can be influenced by whether or not someone is already out on a pretrial release. But, at the end of the day, part of the issue is we do have a presumption of innocence in our judicial system. So the fact that someone is, has been arrested for a presumed criminal offense does not mean that they've already been automatically been assumed to be guilty of that criminal offense. So it can't necessarily legally be held against them when they're, when it's being determined, because there is that presumption of innocence. And that's just the way our system works. And I think we would prefer a presumption of innocence to the alternative, which is a system like in the UK where a person accused of a crime actually has to prove their innocence before a court, rather than our system where the government has to prove that you are guilty. And so the whole point of the system is to protect the innocent. And sometimes that does mean that there are cases that are just absolutely, staggeringly, seemingly obvious that somebody should not have been out. And obviously there are differences in policy, and district attorneys can make a huge difference there.
That's right. They sure can. The district attorney race, the judicial races, the court of appeals races, like I said, something that a lot of time doesn't get a lot of attention, or it's not at the top of the talking points list, if you will, but these are races that absolutely touch and affect the communities that you are living in. And so they're really important. And we're going to wrap it up here in just a few minutes, but I have to ask one final question, and I definitely am going to start with Jim on this one. But we got to talk about this. There are a couple of federal races we have going on. I believe we've got U.S. House District 3, U.S. Senate, U.S. House of Representatives. And so you're certainly welcome to share any thoughts you may have on any of those. But I'll kick it off and just ask, what would you say the top two federal issues that connect most directly to Lenoir Jones and Greene County would be?
I think one's always budgetary. you know,
Yes.
and how that works. We do have a spending issue at the federal level, in my opinion. But, you know, they've made changes at the federal level with how money flows to the state. So the state's going to have less money, so that means local governments are going to have less money. And that is going to be the number one issue that we see. We need immigration reform. And I don't care if it's been Republicans or Democrats, it doesn't matter. Over the last 50 years, everyone's talked about it.
Oh, yeah.
And no one gets anything accomplished. And I'd rather move the football 5 yards than do nothing. And when I say immigration reform, make no mistake, I believe we need immigration. We cannot function without it. We don't have the labor force in our country. We don't have people
right.
to, you know, everyone talks about migrant workers and produce. What about healthcare workers, engineers? We don't have
Correct.
enough of anything. And we do need a healthy immigration program that is broken. And I think those are two big spotlight areas for the federal government going forward. That also impacts local budgets because the states had a surplus for the last 6 years, like no other time in history. And too many local governments, their way of solving problems was, well, we'll have to ask the state for some money. Those days they're over.
Right.
You know, we had some golden age here for the last 6 years, but the state's not going to have that kind of money anymore.
That's right. I would totally agree with that. And this question, we're gonna ask this. This will be our last question, and I'll tell you what we'll do on this one. We'll just go right down the line. So we'll start with Catherine, let you answer, Christy, and then we'll go to Jim. This question is irrelevant now because right now the polls are literally just a moments away from closing in this primary election. But as you all know, the general election is coming up in November. And so with all the races we have here, regardless of how they'll be decided tonight, looking forward to November, I would like just to simply ask each of you this one question. What do you wish every voter would ask themselves before they vote in the general election coming in November? Catherine?
I would love for people to ask themselves, I don't care what this person talks about, how they will, you know, whether they're aligned with Republican Party, whether they're aligned with the Democratic Party. I would ask myself, is this a person who can make the hard choice, the choice that maybe won't be popular but is necessary? Because there are way too many politicians, and I think this is more of an issue at the federal level, where there are cameras and lights and a lot of money and a lot of popularity contests, but it can be an issue at the local level too. Is this a person that I am voting for who will make the hard choice that won't be popular, that could jeopardize their ability to get reelected, but they will make the choice that is best for their constituents, best for their county, best for their state, best for their country, regardless of whether or not that's going to be a item that will help them in their reelection campaign. And that's the question I want to know when I'm voting for someone, and that's the question I would hope that voters would want to have answered and ask themselves about the candidates they're voting for.
Thank you, Catherine. Christy?
So I just debated in my head, but I'm going to go with my first visceral reaction.
Okay.
They need to ask themselves, has this person exhibited critical thinking skills? Has this person exhibited that they can read what has been placed in front of them? On too many occasions, that has not been the case. So I think they need to be asking themselves, have they invested enough time and energy into identifying which candidates have critical thinking skills, which candidates can think independently, which candidates have done their homework, reviewed what's placed in front of them, and don't just vote off the cuff.
All right, Jim?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I think I'd ask them if they had, like Christy, if they've done their homework and they've learned enough about a candidate to make a decision.
Right.
Because what I see is someone telling them how to vote, whether they be Republicans or Democrats.
That's right.
Someone hands them a sheet. If it's the general election, if it's the primary, they think they know who they're voting for and go down. And I believe in rugged individualism, and I would rather you make your own decisions versus having someone tell you how to vote, regardless of your party.
Very good, and I can agree with all of that. And hopefully you guys that are watching me have done just that. You've gone to the polls, you've done your homework, you've educated yourself on the issues, and tonight you have made your voice heard. And here in just a matter of less than 2 hours probably, we're going to know the results of all of these races. And then we'll start the journey toward November. But until then, I just want to say thank you, Jim Perry, for being here tonight. I really appreciate you. Christy Kelly, Catherine Hardy, thank y'all so much for being here with me. We want to thank you, the viewer. We appreciate you guys that always support us and tune in, encourage us, and read our newsletters and comment on our stories on Facebook and watch shows just like this. We appreciate you guys as well. And once again, those polls close at 7:30. We're moments away, so keep your eye out on our Facebook page tonight. For this primary election, we are going to be posting some graphics that are going to show some initial numbers when those first numbers drop tonight. And then, of course, we'll be posting up what the final results are for all the races that affect Lenoir, Jones, and Greene County. So once again, my name is Aletha Thrower. Thank you so much for watching, and special thank you to our sponsors for this programming tonight, and that would be with Walter Poole Realty, it would be Brooks Poole, and then we also have Chris Humphrey for NC House. So thank you to both of you, sirs, for supporting this and for supporting us. We really appreciate it. Good luck to everyone. We'll see you tomorrow.